So yeah, my name's Ruth Price. I'm a dance movement psychotherapist. I'm also a clinical supervisor. I did my training in Bristol at a place called Dance Voice, but I currently work as a private practitioner, and because of lockdown and the sort of slow after effects of lockdown, I'm still doing a lot of my work online, which, as you might imagine, has been an interesting first time as well to translate dance movement psychotherapy to online work. So that's been fun. So just to say, a brief intro to DMP is what I'm going to do, and then I'm going to hopefully just highlight some of the things that are happening in Wales. I might not read out all the info on the slides, but I think you'll have the info on the slides for posterity, so you can always go back and check it out if there's anything that catches your attention. Just to say that the geography of the human body, as they call it, is a contested site. And that's within various contexts, whether in terms of ability, disability, whether in terms of culture, race, gender. The human body is contested in all kinds of ways, and some of what we grapple with it as psychotherapists is the repercussions of that battling that goes on. The human body is both a container and a communicator, and in dance movement psychotherapy we focus on the body's potential for connection that's common to every one of us. So here's an official definition from ADMP. DMP is an empathic, creative process practiced as individuals and group therapy in clinical, community and educational settings, as well as in private practice. That's the kind of formal definition, and actually it's not the definition I grew up with in my training. The one that I grew up with when I trained was very similar to the American one, which says DMP works with all the various facets of the human body. This is not quoting it, but it outlines that we work with the emotional, the mental, the physical, the spiritual aspects of being a human. But here's another definition from Dr. Acharon. I don't know if I've pronounced your name right. You described it as an embodied intervention, and the therapeutic relational journey involves drawing connections between movement behaviour and life stress and transforming those through the vehicle of creative expression. So that's the other really practical definition, I think, of what DMP is. If you wanted something visual and movement wise, and here's a chance, I can't see most of you, but here's a chance for you to do something physical. How many of you can remember the film The Sound of Music? I know it's very ancient, but there's a classic, I think the actual poster for the film was a picture of what I'm going to describe to you, where Julie Andrews is running across a field in full sunshine, her face is beaming, and she's singing the theme tune to The Sound of Music at the top of her voice, really. So I don't know if you can just try and embody that. Let me just get rid of my shawl a minute, and just sort of fling your arms wide open. Imagine you're running across a field, and if you feel like doing it, make a big noise. I won't, because I'll probably deafen you all, but make a big noise, as big as you can with your voice. And then come back to being a seated person at a screen and feel the difference. And one of the things I used to say to my students, because I used to teach this a long, long time ago, is that if a person can access a completely different pattern of movement to what they habitually do, then you can see the beginnings of therapeutic progress start to happen. It's the beginnings of transformation. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. No. These are some of the principles of DMP. And I can leave you to read them in, as it's going on. But just to reference that, I think last year it was HEIW, showcased the work of DMPs around Wales. And what we'll do here is just highlight some of the current projects that some of those therapists are involved in. But what it did show, that conference showed, was that there's a real breadth of involvement in terms of dance movement psychotherapists in communities in Wales. So their work continues to grow, it continues to develop to meet the need for psychotherapeutic support in our current difficult times. And the profile of DMP across Wales reflects the intrinsic characteristics of this creative therapy. Like I said, it reveals a broad sphere of involvement in nurturing health and well-being in many communities. So, although this particular presentation might highlight some of those projects, there are many things going on that I'm not aware of, and that maybe, whoever's got an overview of all of this, even they might not be aware of. But it's all happening in little pockets, in little relational groups, in little community centres, sometimes not even called DMP. Sometimes it's therapists who are working to get their practice rooted into a setting where it can be then recognised and valued. So you've had a chance to read the principles on the screen. They're very basic explanations of what we do, and when I go to the next screen, I'll talk about some of the embodied skills that come up. But I don't know, some of you might, especially say the drama therapists among you, and if there's any body therapists out there, there's quite a crossover, isn't there, between the other creative arts therapies in terms of the principles that we work with. I think the sort of fine-tuning that DMP's access is the whole language of the body. So these are some of the embodied skills. Attunement, which I think we all understand and have to work with as therapists, really. How do we tune into the other person in the room, or to the group that's in the room? And how do you pick up on what's going on? And in terms of awareness, we are trained and we focus on our embodied awareness and our spatial awareness, but also that kind of indefinable, intuitive awareness, which sort of wraps it all up and comes to little moments of, this is where we go now, and this is what we do next, and that kind of little grace moments, I used to call them. The other thing that is a very useful tool in DMP is a practice called authentic movement, where actually you're working with the movement that the body needs to bring into the space, whatever that might be. It's not about can you do the tango, or do you want to learn a waltz step, although sometimes that has come into some of my sessions, particularly when I've been working with people in addiction recovery where they've wanted to do fun things like that. So yeah, it's about your own personal authentic movement and what does your body want to do in that moment. The other skill that comes into play is movement observation and analysis, where we are trained to observe acutely people's movement and try and draw interpretation and understanding from that for both the therapist and the client, actually. We work a lot with creativity and improvisation, and, like drama therapists and movement therapists, they know all about improvisation as well, and the use of creativity, and how that also links into the use of metaphor. I think the lady who was on just before was talking about metaphor and imagery and how that comes into play in her work. So I thought I might give you a quote from a song for this. Do you remember a very old song that children would sing, or that parents would sing to children about rainbows? Oh, I don't think I should sing it. But one of the lines says, "Listen with your eyes and sing everything you see." It's a bit like that. When we talk about attunement, it's a kind of kinesthetic awareness. It's a deep embodied listening. And sometimes I think it almost is a bit like synesthesia, where you sort of, you see something and you hear something, but you then see it and hear it and know it in a completely different level of your understanding. That sounds a bit arty-farty, but I hope you understand what I mean. Here you go. This is an area which I don't know how many DMPs are working in it in the UK or in Wales. I know Tanya, you are definitely, in terms of your body hotel and your staff wellbeing work. But I think it's an arena that has shown fruitfulness when DMPs have got involved. In fact, a lot of community dance workers are infiltrating this scene and using their dance skills to demonstrate to teams how to learn to be better leaders, basically, in a very simple way. So there's a leadership guru called Gary Yuckle, I think that's his name anyway, G. Yuckle, and he says leadership is the process of influencing others to understand and agree about what needs to be done and how it can be done. I can't read that word, where's my screen, never mind. And the process of facilitating individual and collective efforts to accomplish the shared objectives. I don't think it takes an awful lot of imagination for you to read that definition and see, actually, that's a bit like what a therapist does when she's working with either an individual or a group. So, I think there's a reluctance to say, oh, we're influencing others, but actually there is an influencing going on. And when you get DMPs working with teams, with management teams, they draw on some of the skills that they use in their own facilitation to inform the practice for managers and leaders in corporate settings. So, for instance, self-awareness. The worst leaders are the ones that are totally unself-aware. The practice of presence. How do you engage with that when you've got a team of people around you, when all kinds of other things might be kicking in? How do you enable your presence to be in the room in a moment by moment, in the now approach? Things like improvisation, that's a very practical skill that comes in really useful when you're trying to facilitate a group. And then the whole area of nonverbal communication. DMPs utilise the language of the body. They look at rhythms, they look at posture, they look at gesture, they look at tone of voice, and they kind of roll all that together and build a sort of composite understanding of the group or the individual that they're working with. There's a DMP in the States called Candy Beers, and she refers to an apparently well-known leadership book. I'm afraid I haven't read it. It's called 1 Minute Manager. And the description she puts there, or the description that he uses in that book, she compares it to how a therapist might work. So I hope you can see that there's potential for further application of DMP, not just in mental health settings, not just with the NHS, not just with community settings, but also in the corporate world. Because actually, we're just a bunch of human beings trying to make this world work and trying to make ourselves work better within the context we find ourselves in. So, these are some of the examples that are currently going on in Wales. Tanya is, from what I gather, extremely busy doing all of this kind of stuff. So she's working with the Body Hotel, which is about encouraging and facilitating employee well-being. She's also developing work with the LGBTQ plus community. She sent me a little text just the other day to remind us all about her forthcoming performance, which focuses on that conversation. She also does work beyond Wales in terms of training and workshops. So she's fully embodying, I think, that sort of breadth of involvement that I was talking about. And I think creative therapists, that sort of reflects their creativity. They sort of push into all kinds of areas because they think, oh, this could work here and this could work here. And I think this little summary of what Tanya's up to reflects that creative expression of therapeutic intent. Here are some of the guys who were referred to, I think, in the last conference last year. Samina, who is up in Gwynedd. She's exploring the possibilities of working more in nature, because she sees that nature in itself has a healing communication to offer to our embodied lives. She also is showing a bit of a spread in terms of her involvement with therapy work and with creative expression, and she's in the middle of trying to develop a project with an actress using drama and dance to enhance well-being and self-care amongst healthcare practitioners. Then there's Roisin Murphy-Mortimer, who is a movement psychotherapist and a yoga teacher, and she's working on some after-school projects funded through Platform and the Extra, and she's working with a couple of other DMPs and some creative artists, focusing on a really key issue in young people in terms of body image. And then Sarah Rogers O'Connor, also working in South Wales. She and Roisin are going to be starting a new project. Oops, I went back by accident, sorry. I think in the autumn, and they're going to be working for patients experiencing like chronic pain. So as you can see, some of the applications of DMP are many and various, just in the few examples we've got here. Matilda Tonkin-Wells is also developing some projects that cross over into performance as well as therapy. She's looking at collaborating with New Pathways to work with those who've experienced sexual violence. Her online ongoing DMP work is with Welsh-speaking agricultural workers in North Wales. So again, there's a real range of input and involvement. Emma Dixon, who did some work, I can't remember how long ago actually, working with veterans and ex-servicemen, and used the work that she did with them to create a dance film to highlight the issues of post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of being involved in conflict and combat. She's now developing a similar similar expression in a mixed media film, but working with ex-service women to highlight their experiences. I apologise for the coughing. It's the tail end of a bout of COVID a couple of weeks ago. So, right. Oh, I forgot to quote Samina. She was in her last presentation at the conference. She said something interesting, which highlights the fact that neuroscientific research and the current findings are increasingly underlining the effectiveness of the embodied practice of DMP. And she said in terms of her work, working with the body, she sees that with the patterns of body movement, they create changes in behaviour quicker than when we logically try to work things out. So, and that's from someone just working in the field and saying, actually, what these neuroscientists are saying, yeah, this is happening in the work that I have with my clients. I can see it happening. Okay, are there any questions before I just give you a couple of examples, say, from my own client work? Or
not at the moment, Ruth, but I'm pretty sure questions will start probably in soon. I'm just struck by, even though, we are all like drama therapy, DMP, we don't have a training program in Wales, but there's also hope that this keeps flourishing. But I'm just struck by this idea between, some dance women psychotherapists are working with a variety of client groups, also balancing the performance or media aspects of the work. So I just was like really struck by the different bridges in that type of work.
Yeah, yeah. And it keeps happening, I think, because many DMPs started off with I can't say how many, you know, I don't know what the percentages are, but they started off as dancers or people with a real interest in dance. And then history or, you know, experience led them into wanting to combine their skills and their experience, and they ended up as DMPs. But the creative urge to express with the body still goes on. Oh, sorry. This is because I haven't talked for this much for a while.
I had a bit of a, I guess, a little question, Ruth. If you've, in your experience of the field, have you encountered a lot of resistance to the word dance or movement in DMP? Does it, does it turn people off when you say that, or does it invite it? Like, what is your experience been of the use of that word?
Apologies for talking with a cough sweet in my mouth. I'm smiling because when you said that, I had a real flashback memory. I used to work with an addiction recovery group, which were mostly males because they were the ones who came our way. But they were in a program which was, what do you call it? It wasn't a maintenance program. It was, they were signed onto the program on the understanding that they would stop using drugs. And that was the agreement. And the other agreement, as part of their program, was that they had to attend certain things during the week, and they had to get their book ticked. One of the things they had to attend was dance movement psychotherapy. Now, I don't know if you can imagine this, but most of the men that I worked with, and I'm actually very short, I'm like about 5'1" and a bit. So most of these men were great, hulking, big, tattooed, you know, sort of bare. You know how they wear those vests where everything is visible and every tattoo that they ever had is bulging out all over the place. So they were men who'd lived life and had marked their bodies with some of the violence of what they'd experienced in various ways. And the thought that they had to come and do dance movement psychotherapy, as you can imagine, we had some very interesting responses. So the deal was that it was me and another therapist who would facilitate, and there would be a couple of student trainee DMPs in the room as well, because it was quite a large group. The agreement was that they would stay in the space, basically. That was the bare minimum of their involvement, that they would stay in the space. And then it was up to us as DMPs to work out how to engage them. So it was a journey. And some of the time what ended up happening, probably if anybody was, secretly filming it, probably didn't look very much like dance. Like I said, these guys were big and muscly and strong. And us DMPs, it was a bunch of women, just that's how it happened in that particular era. And I can remember working with a very long, stretchy band, and it was quite strong, thankfully. But we started off in a lovely, friendly DMP circle with as many of the men as would access this particular activity. So there was about half a dozen of them. And then you do all kinds of things with the stretchy elastic. You do shapes, and as a dancer, you experiment with the prop that's been given you, and you do high shapes and low shapes and middle shapes. Well, that is not how those men wanted to work. They basically saw that as a power tool. And I can remember being dragged across the floor and spun. The floor was a wooden, polished floor. We were spun around, we were flung from one side to the other, and you literally had to hang on to this elastic and try and keep your footing, because otherwise you know, all kinds of crazy things would have happened. But you can see how that issue of, do I want to dance? Do men like me dance? No. But can I access this crazy activity? And actually, although what I'm doing is trying to show the therapist how stupid she is at trying to suggest that I even do this, somehow in the mix of that, it shifted to becoming a real game, you know? It wasn't about, can I show my power now that you've got me in this space and showed me yours, let me show you mine. But actually it became a kind of mutual, playful, teasing, and increasingly affectionate process that happened between the team and the guys that came. There was one ridiculous other memory that I'll share with you where they get to choose any kind of props that they might want to use, and the cupboards were full of all kinds of everything, including a box of tap shoes, which, as you can imagine, on a wooden floor, quite loud, and also various tutus. So at one point, there we all were, stomping to the choice of their music, which was a piece of punk music, wearing tap shoes and tutus. I mean, we had a whale of a time. And those guys, do you know, one of them said to me, in fact, many of them would say similar things, but one of them said to me, oh, that was such a laugh. Do you know, I felt like a kid, and I don't even remember playing when I was a kid. And you think, wow. I was really quite moved because I know it had really touched him, and that was the only way he could find words, or they were the only words he could find to try and describe something that was actually quite poignant. This guy who'd lived with abuse from tiny, who'd ended up in an addictive lifestyle because he couldn't cope with the pain of it, in that moment was rediscovering an ability to just play and have fun, and for that to give him a high that he hadn't experienced before. Amazing. That was a very long answer. Sorry, Tanya.
No, that's great. That's great. That gives a really concrete example of you know, different work with clients, which is so important. And then that, you know, there's been a common thread throughout the presentations around connecting to, you know, symbolism, play, and, you know, that sense of belonging with, you know, others in a room, which is really powerful. So thank you.
I was going to just mention a couple of current examples because, like I said, I'm working a lot online at the moment, and interestingly, I've got quite a few clients who have come to me, been referred because of trauma history, and there's two particular women, and one of them is very slowly coming away from a kind of dissociative process, and she suffers with hypoarousal quite a lot, much of the time actually, and that's something that she's trying to work on. And the other one is a real mix of hyperarousal, which then sort of flips into hypoarousal. So it's been interesting working with these two very different women as individuals. They're not in a pairing, and working out how across the screen to communicate some of the embodied power of DMP, because when you're not in the physical space, there's a whole other boundary, a whole other bridge that you have to cross in order to get to the client. And we've used a lot of creative work, a lot of imagination work, because actually for both of them, although they present very differently, accessing movement was really, really painful. For example, when I first started working with the lady who was sort of coming out of some dissociative issues, I wanted to try and get her to move, and I thought, let's just work with really simple movements, like stretching and reaching and pushing and pulling. And we were just working through some of those kind of verbs, and we came to a gathering, which, with my training history, it's a very classic word in terms of Laban analysis, which is a form of movement analysis, to gather and to scatter. So I suggested she use these words as a movement gesture, and she just she put her head down and was just looking down at the table. And I said, are you all right? And she didn't look up immediately. And then she finally sort of glanced at me like this, and then glanced down again, and then glanced away and glanced back. And I thought, we've pushed something here, haven't we? And she said, I can't do that. And it was because the movement was tiny. It didn't have any level of interpretation on it. It was just a technical term, if you like. And yet it tapped right into something that was very painful for her. She didn't want to gather anybody close to her at all. So we had to pull right away. So with both of those clients, I've had to major on what might be called micro interventions. So the tiniest of movements, the tiniest of implied gesture even, and sometimes just stillness, and sometimes stillness and silence, because you've probably all heard this so many times, there's therapists that talk about just being with a client, just being with someone, and sometimes that I've had to do that on online in the middle of the moment, because that's all that they can handle, that's all that they need, and that's all that is accessible to them in that moment. So that's just a couple of little examples really from some current work. Excuse me for coughing. I didn't think I was going to go quite so coffee. I'm just wondering if you would like to engage with some experientials. And I don't know if anybody's visible out there or not, but this for me is quite an unusual thing, to be working with a screen and no faces, and suggesting we do some experientials. Tanya, I just need to access my Spotify a minute, so if I can just escape this and get some music on, is that alright?
Yeah, of course.
Oops. Here it is.
And then while you're doing that, I just wanted to echo Lisa Brown, who's talking about also experiencing some resistance to the word dance, but it's interesting how props, music and play can help overcome this barrier that dance is for others. And that sometimes there's like this notion of dance being effeminate, or there's a shame around the body that's alluded to, within the word of dance. I do, I come from it's different across cultures though, because I come from an island where dance is, dance and music are the main sources of interactions. So there's a very different relationship to the word dance back home that there is, in some parts of the UK. So, there is, I think there's also an opportunity there for DMP to access multicultural pathways for people who don't, English is not their first language, or who are nonverbal. So I think there's an opportunity there, to explore a bit more.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely crosses so many barriers, doesn't it, using nonverbal communication. It's brilliant. Okay, I'm just going to put a little bit of music on, and I don't know if you can initially just do, the first thing I'm going to suggest is, because we're sort of coming almost to the end of this session, I think, looking at my time, whether you can imagine that you're walking out of the front door and rain is starting to fall on your body. No, not that one, sorry. Wrong show. Wrong music. There we are, try this one. So here's the sound of rain, and you're just going to use your fingertips. So let it just go around your perimeter.
Down the volume a little bit on Spotify because so we can't hear you.
Better? That was more like a thunderstorm than rain. So just with your fingertips, go down your arms, like droplets on one hand, and then switch hands, and maybe go up the other arm, and then maybe on your chest. And tune into what this feels like, because you're just exploring your perimeter with a little bit of touch, and maybe down the front of your body. And if you can reach down to your thighs, to your knees, maybe see how far you can go, those raindrops. Maybe imagine the rain is creating a puddle, so you can tap with your toes in the puddle. So you can feel that little tapping, the rhythm of the tapping all across your body. So just ad-lib now, go wherever you want to with those raindrops. And what are you becoming aware of as you do this? Apart from maybe a bit of embarrassment, you might want to just do it on your forehead, around your temples. You might feel the resonance of that tap whenever you go across the bony area. Okay, and then just go fingertip to fingertip and gradually come to stillness. Okay, and then just breathe. I'm going to give you some more music that I'm going to suggest you practice using as much of your body as you can to draw your initial in the air. So whatever your initial is, see how big you can make it. So I'm an R. I'm going to reach down. So you can reach down and round. And all of this you can do seated. But try not to fall off your chair. And remember to use both hands, either first your right and then your left, or use both together to do that initial. And allow yourself to feel the fullness of the stretch. And reach all the way down to the floor if you can. And maybe reach right across if you've got a lovely cross line in your initial. You could do a mirror image on your right side, on your left side. You could do that mirror image together, both right and left. Do it on a different level. You could do it sideways, as if you're writing it horizontally, not vertically. Do the right and do the mirroring horizontally as well. Maybe on the other side. And try and let your arms take your body up as high into the movement as you can reach. So I'm using both hands to do one letter. I'm going the same way, and now I'm going backwards on that letter. And then coming back to centre. And it's good to come back to centre. Feel the joining of right and left. Let that rise up. Reach for your initial. Find the shape of you in the space. You know the limit of your boundaries physically. You know where you begin and where you end. But you don't know the limit of your capacity and your possibilities. All that that initial stands for. There's more to discover. So just come back to that centre place. Reconnect your hands with your body. Let your feet find the ground. Take some nice deep breaths in and out. So breathing in deeply. Breathe out slowly as you can. Breathe in deeply. Slowly out. Come to a place of rest. And allow your breath to just come naturally. So that's just a couple of little very gentle explorations. And in terms of DMP, you could go, well, you use music in the setting. You often let clients choose their music, or you go with complete silence, or you go with using your own song that you might bring or that a client might bring. I worked with some older ladies. That's why that raindrops one came on, because we worked with Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head, and they were chair-bound ladies, elderly, and very cheeky, and we did that song, and they made up their own little dance to it, which was hysterically funny. And this was a group of ladies who, when I started working with them, were going, well, we can't do much, love. Because we're stuck in these chairs, you know, and you know, they found that they could do quite a lot, even though they were sitting in the chair. So I think, unless you want to do some more experiential work, I've got a sort of arty one lined up if you want, but it's completely up to you, Tanya. But I think I've covered all the material that I was meant to cover.
Yeah.
Have I forgotten anything?
I don't know. I guess not. I guess you have. Yeah, if anybody has some questions about DMP in general, or for Ruth, Emma Dixon has joined us, who's also another DMP, and I know Lisa Brown is a DMP. I'm gathering from from the comments in the chat as well. So if you have any questions about the type of work, I know as part of the program, Emma is offering somatic body mapping as a workshop. It's a kind of movement and movement informed and trauma informed work, and Sarah Rogers is doing something around dance for young people based on her work, A Place to Be. Just going through the list in my head of the workshops that we're offering. And there are 4 participants or people based in Merthyr, but I'm pretty sure they'd be really open to have participants in their own groups. I'm doing something on self-care and respite, and I'm doing a workshop on embodied decision making. And yeah, we're also doing a workshop on how movement, dance movement helps. Roisin is doing something on social activism. So that's like, it's a whole, it's a whole really wonderful offer of different types of interventions that just highlighting the way dance movement can really inform different offerings and services. Yeah, Jay is talking about how the exercise is really helpful for their work with young people who have experienced trauma, and it's great just having it.
Some of the details that Tanya was just giving you, it rolls off her tongue much more easily because she's living the organisation and admin of it much more than I am. But some of the details are there if you get a chance to go back to the slides about those various DMPs and what they're up to. So you will be able to pick up details about it. And I imagine if you want to contact any of those people, you can do it through Tanya Acheron because she's got all their links and everything. So if you want any more details about what's happening in any of those areas in Wales, you'll be able to get that info from us. I think one of the things I didn't mention, which is very bad of me, is something that is very dear to my heart in terms of DMP. I worked for about 5 years with a community group of mums and babies, and it was perinatal work with a view to preventing necessary support for antenatal and postnatal depression, and I just sort of launched it as a bit of an experiment, as something that I was very interested in supporting in the community. And when I very first started it, and it was one of my very early ventures into private practice, it was totally scary, and I hired a hall and I went round and talked to a few people in the area, and I got there for my first session with my assistant, and nobody came, and we had a cup of tea and a little dance together and went home. And then the next week a friend of mine came, and she was babysitting some other friend's baby, so that was our second session. And then I was thinking, oh, maybe this was a bad idea, maybe there isn't a need for this after all. And then the third week, a mum who I didn't know and I'd seen at a children's centre in a group that I'd run, she came with her little baby, and it was very embarrassing because it was just me and her and the baby, and we did a little bit of dancing and then had a cup of tea and a chat, and she went home. And then the next week she brought 6 other mums and babies, and that was the beginning of a whole other life, really. That group grew to ridiculous proportions. I had to get a few people in to help us team. It wasn't dance therapy, and I kept telling them that. I said, look, this is not a therapy group, but what you're getting is all of my informed practice in the way that I work here. And one by one, these mums, they started doing crazy things in the dancing with their babies, and we'd have social dances, and we'd have babies on the mat doing daft things with mums, and they just, quietly in their ones and twos would have little chats in the cup of tea time at the end. And I worked with that group of mums, and the idea was that they came until their babies were 12 months old, and then they had to fend for themselves. And I overheard some of them talking about birthday parties, and apparently their babies were getting to 1 and they weren't telling me. So I said, excuse me, ladies, what's going on? I thought, if yours has reached 1, we're meant to say goodbye to you and have a little celebration. And they were going, oh, but you can't get rid of us. Obviously you can't get rid of us because, we're part of your life now. And I said, well, no, that wasn't the deal. So out of that, we then had to develop another group. So we had one group called Baby Bebop, which was for babies up to about 12 months, or until they were crawling so ridiculously that they were wanting to be independent. Then we had to develop another one called Polka Tots. that same group of mums initiated really the development of that grouping, which went on until they were ready for school. And it developed a real community in the area. It ran for about 5 years, well, until that very first group started going to school, and until I actually had to move, and I moved back to Wales a couple of years ago, with the intention of doing the same kind of thing in Wales, but I haven't had opportunity because lockdown hit, and one of my family members had a cancer diagnosis, and everything went a bit ooh. So now I'm thinking, okay, now that things have achieved a different rhythm, lockdown is ending, do I find out about working with the mums and babies again? So that's my current possible dream that might or might not happen. So yeah, I don't think I've said very much about myself, but that's kind of where I'm at the moment. Just to sort of round it all off, really, and say thanks for inviting me to do this. It's a bit of a unknown quantity, Tanya, because we've only met online. But yeah, it's good to have a fresh challenge, and it's good to have the opportunity to find out what's going on in Wales and try and communicate that with you guys. If any of you do want to get in touch, just to ask more questions or say didn't really get that, or I don't know, whatever, again, you can presumably pass them through, Tanya.
Yeah, and you can pop your email down in the chat as well. Lisa had an interesting kind of could be a closing question, because I think you did mention doing some work online and what are the challenges. I've been doing most of my work online as well. But then, yeah, do you find any kind of challenges before we close for the session for today?
Yeah, I think
Opportunities, I guess.
I think working online is a total challenge to everybody's sense of self, because you kind of almost have to leave yourself a sense there, and it becomes out there somewhere, doesn't it? In that kind of in-between space between the two screens. So to then remind yourself about who you are, where you are, what you feel like, and also what else is coming into you as a result of what's going on between the two screens, I think it's been a whole other learning curve. It's not something that you get trained in, obviously, because we don't get trained to work online. And I've found that actually if I'm doing any kind of experiential with a client, I will embody it myself as well. In a different kind of way than I might with DMP. I might kind of embody it for my own sense of self, and that's a really good way of me staying grounded in the moment. And sometimes I will embody it from a DMP point of view, where I'm trying to tune into what I can see of what's going on with the client. I'll try and echo some of their shape or some of their gestures. And another thing that I sometimes do, and this, I don't know whether this will sound a little, and I feel like some of these things I'm just experimenting with, really, so don't take them as gospel, don't take them as rubber stamped ADMP type work, but I've been experimenting with, as I'm in session with someone, I won't always make notes, but I'll occasionally just try and get a quick line sketch of their shape or their facial expression, or what they're doing with their hands. And I was experimenting with that with one particular client recently, and then I was going back through my notes for some reason, and I was impacted myself by the sketches that I'd done, because we had just had a session where I'd done a little sketch of her, and she had her hands over her face like this. And I looked back through, and all the sketches I'd done of her, there was a lot of hand gesture close to the face, and there were quite a few like this. And the interesting thing was that the point where I noticed it, and it sort of underlined something, I thought, she does this a lot, let me just look. And she had done it a lot. And the session that I pinpointed it as something that was a recurrent motif, and why did it suddenly feel very important? In that session, she went on to talk about something that she hadn't felt able to tell me, because she thought, quote, I wouldn't love her anymore, that I'd want to stop working with her. And she wanted to confess that although she was a professional, she would still access smoking and sometimes smoking weed, which she knew didn't fit with her ethical stance at all, but it was just her way of grabbing something and getting it to meet her emotional need. And I just think it's interesting, isn't it, for me, doing that little sketch, capturing a moment over a few weeks, and then realising there was a pattern going on and thinking, what's that going on about? And for me, like, to answer your question, for me that's me connecting something that I'm perceiving and putting it down literally in black and white on a bit of paper. And that keeps my sense of self very slightly as observer witness, not embroiled in the moment. Does that answer your question, sort of? Or does it set another hair running?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I've also experienced a lot of connections, and it is quite exposing to do stuff online, but also it also makes it more accessible for people to join sessions, and also to share movement together. Like in a circle, you can still hide in a circle because the therapist will be looking at some way, or you won't see the people in your periphery. But with online things, that everybody's there, so there's a visibility aspect, which is an interesting therapeutic aspect to work with, really. Um, but it's also allowed. I thought it would really not work. I thought it would not work for DMP, and actually it has. It's been a really interesting conduit for shared moments, for shared movements, for rhythm to come into play. So it is really poignant as well. Obviously, we would love to be together in a room with people. That doesn't always work. Um, but yeah, this is brilliant, Ruth. So thank you so much for gathering all this information, and communicating it so clearly. It's really, really wonderful. So
Can I leave everybody with a question, Tanya?
yeah, of course.
When I was thinking about experientials and stuff, well, anyway, I didn't do this, but I wanted to leave you the question. You know how we've all had to mask up in lockdown? I suppose it's because I was thinking about doing an experiential involving breath. And when you've got a mask on, you become very aware of your breath. But actually, it doesn't go anywhere, does it? It doesn't just screen your face. It also creates a little barrier to your breath, which is, for obvious reasons, a protective measure. But it's a barrier. And I just wondered whether you guys could, as you think about lockdown coming, going, and masks going and going back into real life, that barrier that we got so used to having, which was protective, there's a kind of vulnerability about taking it away. But I just wonder, as we take the masks away, has anything else got caught up in the mask, not just our breath, that maybe we need to, before we ditch them and throw them in the bin, we just need to consider, is there anything else that I might have lost in the process that I need to regain and hold? Just a question for you to consider as you transition out of this phase, hopefully into a fresh, less full of illness phase. There we go. That was it.
Thank you so much. Yes, lots of things to ponder about. What have we lost, and what can we regain? Yeah, I see everybody in the chat really appreciating that reflective question. So thank you so much to everyone.